Hello, everybody. Good evening. Good evening. My name is Maddie Sherbandi, and I'm a summer program assistant here at the Fine Arts Work Center. And most of you are here because you're participating in one of our amazing summer workshops, so you already know what's going on tonight. But for those of you who aren't, for 9 weeks every summer, the Work Center hosts week-long open enrollment visual arts and writing workshops. If anyone here is interested in learning more, you can ask me or any of the other staff on hand after this event. If you're here longer than this week, you should think about taking one of our workshops. I promise you won't regret it. One of our favorite parts of our summer programs is that every week our world-class faculty mesmerize our audiences with presentations and talks. Tonight we're going to hear from 3 amazing faculty members, poets Kimiko Hahn, Vievee Francis, and Campbell McGrath. They will each read from their work and afterwards conduct a joint Q&A with the audience. So before we begin, a bit of housekeeping and some other items of interest. Books by Kimiko, Vievee, and Campbell will be available for sale at the back of the room, and they will also be signing their books at the back of the room next to the bookstore. Books by other members of this year's faculty will also be for sale in our bookstore and at the back of the room, as well as some very pretty folk merchandise on the table next to the gallery. So be sure to check it out. The new Hudson D. Walker Gallery will be open after the event, and right now we are showing a really amazing exhibit called Density's Glitch, which features work by former Falk Fellows. The proceeds of all work sold will go to support Falk's programs, so be sure to check it out after the event. I would also like to give a big shout out to East End Books, who've helped us stock and set up our bookstore. Restrooms and a water bubbler are located down that hallway. And if you are taking a workshop this week, please consider reading at Student Night on Thursday. The sign-up sheet is in the lounge across the courtyard. And finally, please do us all a favor and turn your cell phones to silent. So we will begin with poet Kimiko Hahn, a returning member of the Falk Summer faculty, who is teaching a workshop this week called Capturing the Hybrid Text, Poetry, and Kimiko is the author of Foreign Bodies and 9 other books of poems, including Fever and Toxic Flora, both prompted by science, The Narrow Road to the Interior, a section from Basho's famous poetic journal. Her essay on the Japanese hybrid form, the Zuihitsu and the Toadstool, was published in the American Poetry Review. She is in the MFA program at Queen's College. The Manchester Review praises the strong, driving sense of personal narrative her poems carry, and the Chicago Books notes that she has the unique ability of turning the universally mundane into the uniquely beautiful. Likewise, her readers describe her work as alternately wry and affecting, and praise her unique perspective on the daily and ordinary. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Hahn.
So excited to have a soapbox. I have so many devices up here. Let's just start. First of all, thank you, Falk staff. And a shout out to Kelly, you, and also thank you faculty and students. I have a truly wonderful taking group, and that's a gift to me, for me. So thank you, and thank you especially to my fellow readers this evening, Campbell and Vievee. I can't wait to sit down and hear you both. I'm going to start with a poem from a previous collection, The Artist's Daughter. And because you're writers, I want to warm up to a poem that's in my new collection, which is why I'm going to start this one. When I was writing the poems that would become The Artist's Daughter, I was thinking a lot about being the designated monster in my family. And I can imagine, because you're writers and artists, you know what I'm talking about. What that meant for me at the time is I was actually, thinking about it, but also researching quote-unquote monsters. Necrophiles, sideshow folks, for example, those who have supernumerary parts, extra parts, and premature burial, and then, of course, fairy tales, which also includes premature burial, of course. The poem that I'm going to read began as an exercise. Each of the 7 sections contains allusions to specific fairy tales. You'll get a feel for what the exercise was, so I won't go into all that. Charming lines. As she twirls around, her skirt swirls up. She's lifting her pink flannel skirt. The black river snakes through the blue forest. He drops the orange stones on the path. Thank you, moon. Although every story is about severing cords, the bread, the furnace, we walk home with pockets full of frightful gold. The house overlooks the garden, so dark green it is black. A mother spills milk on oil. The white rivulet streams out the kitchen door over everything but the neighbor's alive greens. Those confess to splinters on the windowsill. The daughter's yellow hair will become a golden ladder. As she twirls around, her skirt swirls up. The girl adores her pink dog. Her mother adores her and her own mother. As she twirls around, her skirt swirls up. She cannot bring her dog to her grandmother, whose fever is hectic. The long pink path collapses. The red cloak, the basket, the jagged teeth, the hot smell as if grandmother left the on. Her nails are pink and white. A sunrise is pink and white. The tree behind the mill bears cherries. Sometimes the fruit is so familiar, even the jays do not pluck any. Ah, little girl, oh, little daughter. As she twirls around, her skirt swirls up. The crows realize raw stumps. She ran holding the jar and fell, cutting open her chest. The scar does not mar her beauty. As she twirls around, her skirt swirls up. The bite of apple does not corrupt, does not seal the sleep in her eyes. 7 pairs of fingers smudge the glass. She can think in her dream state that she dreams. The caterpillar droppings sound like rain outside her room behind the kitchen, where the ashes are gray and gentle. The mice are rats. The mother is dead. The real mother is always dead. As she twirls around, her skirt swirls up. Those rags that smell like foresight. The mother sews doll dresses from scraps of her own silk and chiffon hems. Even the oldest daughter adores dolls. As she twirls around, her gown swirls up. The 12 sisters lift their skirts. The father betrays by being a father, the child, the child. So their dancing slippers wear thin at night. In bed, their ecstatic feet pulse with blisters. My book, Foreign Bodies, began with poems. I fancied that I would write a trilogy, I'll just admit it, of science-oriented books. But, you know, sometimes plans don't work out. So I had a sizable bunch of science-oriented poems, but they really weren't very good. So I kept a few of the poems, one on Dr. Chevalier Quixote Jackson, 19th century laryngologist, 20th century laryngologist. He took out over 2,000, I'll try not to just talk about him for the rest of my time. He took out over 2,000 items from children's upper respiratory system, and you can see all those 2,000 in the Mutter Museum. They're extraordinary, and those are called foreign bodies. I also have a long poem that I kept on Mary Anning, who was a very early paleontologist, not by profession, but because she had to go dig up fossils, carve them out of the coast of Lyme Regis. So her family, her father and the rest of the family would have additional money from selling the souvenirs. So those are still in the book. But I wanted to move to address what was going on around me, which was my father's hoarding and his descent into dementia and eventually death. While writing the poems that will become Foreign Body, I hit a speed bump, and I returned to the exercise I'd given myself for charming lines, which is why I read them. I read that poem. I wrote the poem The Ashes, and long poem, and the early drafts were really dull. There was something missing. There was some kind of electricity missing. So I applied what I learned from Emily Dickinson, and that is agency. So in each of the sections, I added an element of personification, and I feel that this is the poem that I've been trying to write for decades. Ashes. The puppy snarfles to be let out, and I wake to radiator gurgling, then feet crunching the reticent snow. Before I was born, mother sewed her own suits. What do her ashes know? Father shoved snow off the supine roof. Mother crafted Christmas ornaments, glue and glitter and red balls. No tinsel, no angels. Her death started in the living room. For bonsai, pliers the size of a nail clipper, spools of wire, and a fist-sized rock. One bore a petite pomegranate, never to eat, not to touch. Her death began with a baseball bat. In the vineyard, he secured the strongest cane, from training stake to fruiting wire. Pruning with handsaw and lopper, he'd leave a spur for the next season. He shoved her away with direct objects. In a cold snap, if one pipe freezes, the rest may freeze as well. Even before the puppy stirs, even before a baby sister arrived in mother's arms in the misleading car. After the war, after she met father, she smoked menthols but didn't cha-cha anymore. She'd light up and blow out the apoplectic window. He found the ashes on the sill. Fireflies winged for mates or prey outside the savvy window of my own first home, where I sewed a dress too smart to wear. On the stereo, a blues man cried, "I need my ashes hauled." I tucked away our baby's pink layette in circumspect mothballs for a christening that never took place, as well a doll that Auntie crocheted. More than anything, I love tidal pools. I know her ashes are at father's, lost in his charnel of junk mail. He claims that thieves have stolen the box, his knob cutter and root hook. He says, ashes aren't remains anyways. Winter stripped everything to limb and dejected nest. No angels, no Kresge. I don't know whose recollections are suspect. After leaving Maui, mother learned to swim. She loved tidal pools more than anything. In my kitchen, logs blink in the fire. Through blinds, the wind blusters and browbeaten trees creak in the orchard. The rain pours, then stops for sun. If he lost mother's ashes, what more could I stand? Omusubi tastes best on black beaches. Because mother never learned to swim, she watched her 5 brothers from a blanket. On the intransient subway, I call if I've passed my station. Metal smells of being fertile again. His mother said her social station. Mother showed our little girl how to sift flour and how to crank an egg beater. After Father lost her, he barred us from his rooms and yard, where at night long red worms slithered up from the ground. Mother's ashes know. Before the puppy snarfles, Father shoves snow off the supine roof. For bonsai, use pliers the size of a nail clipper. In the vineyard, the strongest cane. In a cold snap, a hairdryer on frozen lips. Fireflies winked for mates or prey outside, while I tucked away my baby's pink layette. Mother's ashes know their box is in the living room, where she didn't cha-cha anymore. Where has winter stripped everything to the nest? In my kitchen, the logs blink in the fire, and I know omusubi tastes best on a back shore. I know, too, she doggedly showed granddaughters how to graft flowers. The poems I've been writing in the past 5+ years have been forms, and oftentimes they give a nod to past writers. I'm going to read a few of those in my remaining minutes. Here is a triolet, which a student of mine introduced me to this form. A riotous disorder. She mistakes one word for another, something her brain naturally concocts. Her unruly gray matter and her heart mistakes one word for an other, razor for river, cistern for sister, even cock for clock. She mistakes one word for a mother, a safe her brain naturally unlocks. I finally was able to write a sestina, and here it is. To be a daughter and to have a daughter can forecast at odd relationships, especially when the mother hazards to write on her own hours what time's left while keeping the baby safe from herself as she and the baby wail, one in the crib, the other on the floor to wail with the vacuum cleaner so the daughter can't hear her mama drowning. So the new relationship isn't all arithmetic and geometry, all right angles barely connecting. What is left at dusk, still tender and safe, you couldn't pluck and lock in a safe, not unlike a girl calf and her mama whale, 2 generations of breaching daughters applauded by tourists on the ship, but more likely if they are right whales or what's left of those docile equatorial pods never left by men hunting their fat, they are not safe. Larger than grays, smaller than blue whales, mother and son or daughter in their relationship are so buoyant that whalers the right whale to hunt. Funny, given the mariner's right to trick a man to think he'd been left for the sharks without the safety of pity or prayer, then that whaler would wail for his own mother or wife or daughter. When it comes to daughter-mother relationships, I've written on both till there's nothing left, without breaching safety, without wailing. After all, I love daughters and I love ships. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kimiko. That was beautiful. Now we're going to hear from poet Vievee Francis, who many of you heard give a fascinating and thought-provoking keynote talk on Sunday evening as a kickoff to our 2-week poetry festival. Vievee is a returning faculty member who is teaching a workshop this week called and I think to myself, wonderful world. Eco-poetry, the pastoral, and a walk in the wildwood. Vievee is the author of The Shared World, forthcoming from Northwestern University Press, Forest Primeval, Horse in the Dark, and Blue Tail Fly. In 2009, she received a Jaffe Writers Award, and in 2010, a Kresge Fellowship. She is the recipient of the 2021 Aiken Taylor Award for Modern American Poetry. She serves as an associate editor of Callaloo and an associate professor of English and creative writing at Dartmouth College. Muzzle magazine presents a simple exploration of her poems, calling them deceptively simple, childish yet profound. Her readers describe her poems as provocative and intimate, and appreciate the honesty and curiosity of the speaker. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Vievee Francis.
I think so. You can hear me? Break me, and I'll sing. A voice like marrow, a blood yolk spilled upon the counter. You can't stop this song. More hands than yours have closed around my throat. You may crack me, you have cracked me. I'm frightened, but so what? I'll testify. Witness, if you can, listen. I slurped the frog leg soup gone bad, held a brass spoon like a barrel in my mouth. I could tell you what you want to hear, but I'd be broken just the same, so why not sing? I'm singing now, louder this time, and in the round. We are a wounding of red-plumed birds, every voice a bloody feather in the bone crown. Taking it for Gabby of a Caressy and Jen Groats. I never remember the knuckles, though his hand was bare, though their hands were bare. I remember the impressions left on this skin, the wilting and the welting. I don't remember the sound, not one smack. I remember falls, myself falling to the floor or sidewalk or against a brick wall my head met after a push. There were many pushes. Girls punched. I punched. Pulled one down by the hair and kneed her as my own head bled. Girls didn't punch until high school, but I had always punched. What kind of girl are you? My father asked. The kind who wants to live, I said. And I did want to, until I didn't anymore. But I wanted the leaving to be on my own terms, so I hit my father back. He owned me like any good country father. He waited for a husband to tame what he couldn't corral, throw a rope like fingers around a neck. When I missed a boy, finger holds, I remember those. And me initially making a fist wrongly and punching, and I didn't mean to miss. I meant to hit the line below the belly, the belt line. When broke me in the snow, my north. I'm still afraid to say his name. I wore shoes too thin for the weather. Who had ever seen snow? And had a Georgia lilt like molasses on a sore throat, sugar raw, and he hated the sound of it. He was black, and I was black, and I was so happy to be in Detroit, and he aimed for my heart-shaped mouth, my gap teeth, my too sweet tongue. I felt the juvenile weight of him above me like snow after dark, falling and hard. I'm gonna teach you to talk regular. And I stopped speaking at all. I kept my swollen mouth shut and a straight razor in my math book, dreamt of a bat to crack against his chest. A woman like me with soft hands, not hands of the field, My grandmother, but hands meant to stroke and soothe needs a weapon. So I studied the art of war and watched boxing. And where else was all this rage to go? Is this too dramatic? Find another story. Find a lie. And love, body after body, fell beneath my own, though my own was broken, and I made love like a sea creature, fluid as if boneless, though my bones would rattle if not for this fat I cherish. Wouldn't you? And I grew to love the heavyweights, myself with one in the ring. Imagine him punching me and punching me again, saying, I'm sorry, so sorry to have to love you this way. The shared world. Into the bow of your ear, I whispered the secret story. Now you can't sleep either. Consider it part of your own memory, connecting our childhoods that would have otherwise never crossed. I fell down, your knee was scraped. I stuffed the yellow cake into my mouth, and your stomach cramped. When you were abandoned, grief filled my well. The private ravages of our spent youth and adulthood now implicitly intimate. You pull me to you because I have already softened your sharp elbows. The pressure of your fingers in my shoulder leaves an impression as if in need I had dared touch myself. We are insomniacs, the grip of night freeing us from the slept-through day and its demands. It is true, once you know, you can't unknow. So we ruminate on literature and the gods and continually seek the ousia of the empty jug. But we need no wine, really. We are eager to get on with it, to take in or do whatever forwards this living. The tripwire, keeping us tied, kite to string, present to past, arrow to quiver. On the piney woods, I know some of you remember this. This is not new knowledge for many of you in the audience. On the piney woods, death, Bobby Frank Cherry, and me. This opens with two epigraphs. The first, Martin Luther King Jr., his eulogy for the 4 girls killed in the Birmingham bombing 1963. They move through the exit. The drama of their early life comes to a close. These children, unoffending, innocent, and beautiful. Second epigraph, the testimony of Willa Deanne Brogdon, ex-wife of Bobby Frank Cherry. He said he lit the fuse. Sometimes I wander around wondering where my mother is. The family buried her next to her own mother, out there. The hard pines darken early. Anyone can hide and not be found for years. Frank Cherry laid low there. The girls came in his dreams. You can't live in those woods and not be haunted by what you've done. So he had to be given to visitation than most. They wouldn't have come whole. They would have arrived in bits and pieces the way he left them. They would have held bits of church brick and holy bric-a-brac. 1 or 2 might have come as a glove or a hat small enough for a child's head. I imagine they were laughing or singing before the bomb went off. So they may have moved through his house's voices or the tiny tap of a shoe. I lived out there when he did. I didn't know he was there. It makes sense. It was a place inhabited by the lost and the found, by horror and grace. I am haunted by my memories, as present as ghosts. I believe in ghosts, and am grateful I have committed no crimes. Though I am untouchable, I was born so, under 4 pounds, bent-legged, pale and stricken. I went straight into a metal tit, monkeyed against a glass and metal frame. The girls would have been only a few years older than me. They died as I was born. They were blown to the winds. I was born into the storm of them. I cannot hold it all together. the pieces of them, of me. My mother hated my needing to touch her, to have her in my sight, young and free to flit and flirt away into an evening. I cried myself sick whenever she left. I wound myself around her when she returned and could feel the wince in her gaze and her gloved hands pushing me away. When we feel unloved, does it matter who doesn't love us? She did. No crime was committed. Had Cherry known I lived down the road, he would have hated me. I knew early on I could be blown to bits by any white man with enough rage. It's not a matter of degree. It's a matter of intent. Those girls were loved. Why aren't they here? Why am I? Forgive me for Matthew. Forgive me, the house that keeps me from moving, that lets me rest because I must rest. These legs that have mastered the stairs for now, maybe for a while. This face that you love that I will never love. And this hair I refuse to press, that you press your face into, and no one near me knows how to comb, which enrages me, since I have been trained to manage, to cut, to arrange anyone's hair. Forgive me this rage that means we may not visit South Carolina, though I'm used to Tennessee and North Carolina. This rage that makes breathing difficult. I pant in my sleep as I'm panting now, as if running chased my kin and would see me dead if I'm not careful. Forgive the truth that I won't stop speaking to you and others. We know how others hate to be seen through, and there is nothing a man won't do if a mirror is held before him. Forgive my inability to keep friends close, but you would not those who are unkind, and too many are. I may be wrong. Forgive me. My brother is unkind. You are kind enough to forgive him. Only you forgive me. Forgive me for saying this, but it's true. You know I live in a punitive world, how much joy it takes in punishing me. Forgive my being unable to bear it. I cannot bear it. Forgive my garden of weeds and this body loved well and now needs this bed to sleep and dream of nothing. Forgive my empty head, because what would fill it but my days? So many days I have cried into a place of indifference. I no longer cry at all. I ask you to forgive the heaving and the request only you can fill. Only you forgive what I won't and cannot.
Thank you, Vievee. That's why we asked you to come back and read tonight. Finally, we're going to hear from Campbell McGrath, who is a new Falk summer faculty and is teaching a workshop this week called Researching the Ineffable. Campbell is the author of 11 books of poetry, including Spring Comes to Chicago, 7 notebooks, 20 Poems for the 20th Century, which was a finalist for the 2017 Pulitzer Prize, and most recently, Nouns and Verbs, New and Selected Poems. He has received numerous literary prizes for his work, including the Kingsley Tufts Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a MacArthur Fellowship. He lives with his family in Miami Beach and teaches at Florida International University. Readers enjoy his expansive and liberating poetry, with praise for poetry that is as beautiful as it is intellectual, and the ways in which his work makes readers see nature, cities, and life differently. Let's give a warm Falk welcome to Campbell McGrath.
Thank you, David and Sharon and Sarah and Maddie and everybody and all of the community here. That's an exciting community that I've heard about for decades, and I'm really glad to be here this year for the first time. I'm going to read 6 poems, and I'm going to read 2 each from my most recent books, which are the new and selected poems and 20th century book, XX, and then 2 new poems, okay? And I'm going to start where the selected poem starts, with a poem saying no. Saying no. No, sir, absolutely not. Sorry, but no. Not sorry, actually, just no. Keep it simple, plain vanilla, nope. Big N, big O. No way, no how. Negative, nuh-uh, ixnay, niet. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. Not likely, not likely. Maybe, but I doubt it. Possibly, conceivably, in theory. Well, yeah, sure. Okay, why not? Oh, definitely, yes. Wow, I mean, anything at all. When can we begin? There's a poem called Birds and Trees. I'm tired of not being a great blue whale. I'm sick of frills and gossamer ostinatos. I want to feed a Happy Meal to a cheetah. I'm tired of not being Nicanor Para. I want to say, basically, fuck you to poetry with all its outlandish maunderings. Magic numbers piss me off. I'm bored by rubrics and party lines. The bloody giblets of nostalgia disgust me. The past is a sadly inadequate word for what we've been through, earthly existence, this life right here. Nature ruled the planet long before our entrance, yet surely its reign was nothing more than a pulsating machine works of appetite, ultra vivid but purely mechanical, a rococo cuckoo clock, trivialized by its own clownish reality, its too literal presence in the moment. Is the air disport truly so wonderful, vainglorious swallows making a spectacle of themselves, as if to prove their familiarity with a drama in which we resemble minor characters bumbling on stage in the final act? Of course we admire the birds and trees, but their diffidence insults our dignity. And when, inevitably, we lash out in anger, nature has none but herself to blame. For we, too, bear the mark of her flawed manufacture from our first gasping, egg-damp cries. To be human is to be scissor-cut bold strokes from imperfectly pressed paper. Our brains, like huge, unblooming peonies, tug our bodies inexorably earthward, while language resembles a clutch of party balloons, intended to lift us to salvation, but there's so much that cannot be captured in pink latex and self-reflective mind. Snow falling on the temple gardens of Kyoto, the heroic loneliness of cemetery flags, even our drive along the Palisades Parkway on a summer day so long ago. Past, what an awful word for something we can never get beyond, no matter how far we travel. The Palisades Parkway comes to an end in Rockland County, New York, just past the abandoned hamlet of Town. All good things must come to an end, but not all good things end in Doodletown, New York. Okay, I'm going to turn to XX. X is a sequence of 100 poems written for the 20th century, one for every year of the century, written mostly in persona. We've been talking with Vievee's really riveting opening about the self and masking and when you are you and when you are you pretending to be another you, and is there a you in the first place? I'm like the opposite of Vievee, who had to give herself permission to write as the you. I wrote as the me for so long. I was so bored of it. It was delightful to be able to write as other people. And once I started, I said, oh, this is great. So I said, what if I tried a whole century in different voices? Was that a thing I could try? So it's a variety of voices. This one, like the last one, is about birds in a way. This poem is called Martha, 1913, and it's in the of Martha, the last passenger pigeon, who died in 1914 at the Cincinnati Zoo. 3 years I've been alone here now, the last, the endling. 3 years whistling in the dark since the rest of them passed, dead and gone, even old George, who shared my perch arcade, and lately these bars through which we glimpsed a pale blue sky, no longer bewildered by companionable wings. Say I miss him much. He was a tiresome, ordinary bird, even for our kind, were never flashy. Even when our billions cast earth into shadow, even when we darkened Ohio with the shade of a single flock. Can't say I'll miss this cage, prison cell visited by unsightly gawkers, when I follow George, and all memory of our song has vanished from these familiar hills and woods and gentle river valleys. You were our perfect match, Ohio, drab, anodyne, wan but fertile. Once we ruled the roost, but now comes the turn of those sly, scurrying creatures we often laughed at from the safety of our nests. Safety? What did we know? We were pigeons. There was no hickory so high they could not climb to steal our eggs. No refuge in crowds from their shotguns and nets, their poison seed spread among the tantalizing corn rows. No number so big they could not subtract it down to zero. No, not zero, not yet. Got one more winter in me and feel no rush to depart. Though God knows Cincinnati is enough like hell that I should recognize the original if I were to happen upon it. Farewell, Ohio. You've earned the gratitude of this unlovely dove, last of a vanquished species. Farewell and good luck. They are not to treat you any kinder beneath a sky that echoes only the longing in their hearts. And a lot later in the century, 1980, poem, I'm going to read one of these two poems for Czesław Miłosz, the great poet of moral witness and compassion of the 20th century, or the late 20th century at least, who was a teacher of mine briefly at Columbia, which is a great honor. And this is a poem called A Castle Surrounded by Chestnut Trees. Turned from the sun as if in grief, half earth drinks the pauper's milk of stars. When morning comes, the world that greets the sleepers is no longer nature's primordial realm, but a planet of old women scattering birdseed, dark-eyed girls trying to look very grown up after school, naive shrines adorned with pink dahlias, apple trees crabbed with fruit amid vegetable plots running down to the train tracks, a pheasant stubble, red and green plumes like the helmet of a cavalry officer seen in a vision, the tracks that run to Auschwitz, the bitter dust of Birkenau spiraling skyward in billows, a winding sheet, a shroud. Having made the earth our own, irrevocably, the contest for its future becomes a human struggle, moral, ethical, spiritual, rhetorical. And those undamaged by the brute mechanisms of evil must live life as a dispensation, a gift. We, the unbent, the untortured, must bear witness to inhumanity wherever it takes root. In the glyphs and stumble stones, the keel strakes and roof tiles, the leaf shutter, the rain shutter, among archival fragments, tesserae, lost teeth, in the glow, the tallow reek, at the last hush, listening for the shovel fall of earth upon a coffin lid. Rain on the Vistula River, gray as salt. Wind in the river rushes and silver willows, hack of dust at the back of the throat, burning there, clotting like poison. The net tightens. Distant mountains bar their passes against me. The past assembles a cage of falling leaves in air. I will never escape the 20th century. So 2 new poems. I have a new book coming out next spring from Campbell, and I'll read the first poem and then I'll talk about the first poem. Is very short. It's called Night and Day. Day is as simple as the body. Night is like the mind. Day is water. Night is wine. Day is a flock of sparrows. Night is an owl. Day is a consonant. Night is a vowel. Night is the sacred cat of the Egyptians. Day is a dog, any old dog. Night is salt in the day's wide ocean. Day is bread. Night is fog. So the last poem I'm going to read is a poem called At the Ruins of Yankee Stadium. And I'm reading this in particular because the workshop this week, as you've heard, is called Researching the Ineffable, a phrase which occurs in this very poem, and a notion which arises from a kind of conversation I was part of at Bard Graduate Center a couple of years ago, organized around the subject, what is research? Which brought together people from incredibly different disciplines, from like blacksmiths and photographers to astrophysicists and virologists. And I was asked to be part of this. I was like, but I mean, wait a minute, what do I mean by research? And, you know, then I started to think about it, and I said, well, I do historical research, but I also that, you know, in a kind of Whitman-esque vision of I loaf and invite my soul, the essence of poetic research, you know, which I like because it involves both loafing and the soul, 2 things I think are important and kind of essential to poetry. So I thought about that. So this poem is about that notion. It's about research in a lot of kind of historical and other ways, but so it's for the workshop and for the kind of community here this week. At the Ruins of Yankee Stadium. And I'm writing a future tense level rise in the Atlantic Ocean as a kind of cultural and historical as well as ecological space. So some of that research seeps into this poem, even though it'll be in a different book. At the Ruins of Yankee Stadium. It is that week in April when all the lions start to shine. Cafe tables poised for selfies. Windows squeegeed and fence posts freshly painted around Tompkins Square. Former haven of junkies and disgraceful pigeons, today chock full of French bulldogs and ornamental tulips, superimposed atop old, familiar, unevictable dirt. Lying on the couch, I am drifting with the conversation of bees, a guttural buzz undergirding the sound from a rusty string of wind chimes hung and forgotten in the overgrown beech tree marooned out back. Limbs shaggy with neon green flame-tongue leaflets forking through a blanket of white blossoms. Long neglected evidence of spring at its most deluxe, pure, exuberant fruitfulness run amok. Rigorous investigation has identified dialects buzzing through the plunder fall. Hovering black bumblebees and overworked honeybees neck deep in nectar bliss. As the city to us, blundering against its oversaturated anthers until the pollen coats our skin, as if sugar-dusted, as if rolled in honey and flour to bake a cake for the queen. Yes, she is with us. It is spring, and this is her coronation. Blossoming pear and crabapple and cherry trees, too many pinks to properly absorb, every inch of every branch lusting after beauty. To this riot of stimuli, this vernal bombardment of the senses, I have capitulated without a fight. But not the beech tree. It never falters. It is stalwart and grounded and garlanded, a site-specific creation, seed to rootling to this companionable giant, tolerant and benign, times have I reflected upon their superiority to our species, the trees of earth? Reflection, self-reflection. My job is to polish the mirror, to amplify the echoes. Even now I am hard at work, researching the ineffable. I loaf and invite my soul, for Walt Whitman is ever my companion in New York, thronged carcass of a city in which one is never alone and yet never unnagged at by loneliness. A hunger as much for the otherness of others as for much-sung self, for something somewhere on the verge of realization, for what lies around the corner, 5 or 6 blocks uptown, hiding out in the Bronx or across the river in Jersey. Somewhere on the streets of the city right now, somebody is meeting the love of their life for the very first time. Somebody is drinking schnapps from a paper sack, discussing Monty Python with a man impersonating a priest. Waiting for the bus to South Carolina to visit her sister in hospice. Someone is teleconferencing with the office back in Hartford, Antwerp, Osaka. Someone is dust sweeping, throat clearing, cartwheeling, knife grinding, day trading, paying dues, dropping a dime, giving the hairy eyeball, pissing against a wall. Someone is snoozing, sniffling, cavorting, nibbling, roistering, hiding, snuggling, confiding, pub crawling, speed dating, pump shining, ivy trimming, tap dancing, curb kicking, rat catching, tail telling, getting lost, getting high, getting busted, breaking up, breaking down, breaking loose, losing faith, going broke, going green, feeling blue, seeing red. Someone is davening, busking, hobnobbing, grandstanding, playing the ponies, feeding the pigeons, gull watching, wolf whistling, badgering the witness, pulling down the grill and locking up shop, writing a letter home in Pashto or Xhosa, learning to play the xylophone, waiting for an Uber X, conspiring, patrolling, transcending, belittling, testifying, bloviating, absolving, kibitzing, kowtowing, pinky swearing, tarring and shingling, breaking and entering, delivering and carting away, and wreathing lampposts with yellow ribbons, reading Apollinaire on a bench littered with fallen petals, waiting for an ambulance to pass before crossing the avenue toward home. No wonder they fear it so intensely. The purists and isolationists in Kansas, the ideologues in Kandahar. It is a relentless negotiation with multiplicity, a constant engagement with the shape-shifting mob, diversely luminous as sunlight reflecting off mirrored glass in puzzle pieces of apostolic light. Certainly this is not the eternal city, but it is certainly imperial, certainly tyrannical, democratic, demagogic, dynastic, anarchic, hypertrophic, hyper-real, an empire of rags and photons, an empire encoded in the bricks from which it was built, each a stamped emblem of its labor-intensive materiality. Hundreds of millions barge down the Hudson each year from the clay pits of Haverstraw and Kingston after the Great Fire of 1835, a hinterland of dependencies, quarries and factories and arterial truck farms delivering serum to the muscular heart, a toiling collective of Irish sandhogs and Iroquois beamwalkers and Ivoirian umbrella vendors collecting kindling, on fire that has lured, like moths, the entire world to its blaze. As with my tree, the hubbub of bees, its exaltation. Apis make honey, Bombus, the humble bumbler, and the tree a common American beech. Rules the yard, overawing a straggling ailanthus hard against the wall of the Con Ed substation. Along the fence, some scraggly boxwood shrubs, a table collapsed into rusted segments, 2 piles of bricks. What's their story? Who made them, carted them, set them as a patio, and who undid that work to create these mundane, rain-eroded monuments to human neglect? Why does nobody tend this little garden? Undisciplined ivy scales the building in thick ropes and coils of porcelain-berry vine, whose fruit will ripen to obscene brilliance come autumn, those strange berries, turquoise, violet, azure. Ah, I've lost my train of thought. Berries, the city, people, bricks, the past, bees in a flowering beech tree, symbiosis, streams and webs and permutations, viruses replicating, mutating, evolving, books in a library, bricks in a wall, people in a city. A man selling old golf clubs in the corner of Ludlow Street. A woman on the F train carefully rubbing ointment up and down her red, swollen arms. Acorns, tossing them into the Hudson River from a bench, as I did when I was Peter Stuyvesant, when I was Walt Whitman, when we were of the Lenape and Broadway our hunting trail. Then the deer vanished, the docks decayed, the towers fell. The African graveyard was buried beneath concrete as the memory of slavery has been obscured by dogma and denial. The city speaks 100 languages. It straddles 3 rivers. It holds 40 islands hostage, an archipelago of memory, essential and insubstantial and evasive as the progeny of steam grates at dawn, a congregation of apparitions. The Irish have vanished from Washington Heights, but I still see myself eating a cold pot roast sandwich, watching McHale's Navy on black and white TV in my grandmother's old apartment. I remember the parties we used to throw on Jane Street, shots of tequila and De La Soul on the tape deck, everyone dancing, everyone young and vibrant and vivacious. Decades later, we discovered a forgotten videotape, and our sons, watching with bemused alarm, blurted out, "Mom, you were so beautiful." She was. We all were, everyone except the city. The city was a wreck, and then a renovation project, and now it is a playground of privilege, and soon it will be something else, liquid as a dream. Empires come and go. Ours will fade in turn. Even the city will retreat step by step as the Atlantic rises against it. But water is not the end. Bricks are made of clay and sand, and when they disintegrate, when they return to silt, new bricks will be made by hands as competent as ours. People will live in half-flooded tenements. People will live on houseboats moored to bank pillars along Wall Street. It's all going under, the entire eastern seaboard. The capital will move to Kansas City, but nobody will mourn for Washington. Someone will invent virtual gasoline. Someone will write a poem called At the Ruins of Yankee Stadium, which will be set to a popular tune by a media impresario, and people in Ohio will sing it during the inning stretch, remembering or imagining the glory of what was. Time is with us viscerally, idiomatically. Time inhabits us like a glass bowl filled with tap water at the kitchen sink, pink stones, and a sunken plastic castle with a child's face etched in a slate gray window. Fish swim past, solemn as ghosts, and the child smiles sadly, wondering perhaps bees will pollinate underwater. He seems a little melancholy. He must miss his old home, a skin-honeyed hive of multifarious humankind, a metropolis of stately filth doused in over-rich perfume. The castle door swings open, and the boy emerges like an astronaut stepping warily onto the moon. When he sees us, through the warping lens of the bowl, watching him with desperate, misfocused passion, we are as gargantuan as the past, and he as spectral as the future, raising one small hand to wave goodbye. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Campbell. Wow. If we could have Campbell and Vievee and Kimiko come back on the stage, we'll do a little Q&A. I'm going to shove this thing out of the way.
here it goes. Or were you looking at a piece later and then thinking, oh, wait a minute, and sort of retroactively bringing that structure in?
The question was, I'm supposed to repeat the question. Yeah. The question was, for the sestina and triolet, did I sit down to write a sestina and triolet, or did it come sort of after, sort of reforming something? I rarely take a work and then form it into a given form. More often than not, if I'm writing, I'll write a form as an exercise, not a poem or sestina, but it's an exercise. It's doing the sestina. It took me decades to get like the right kinds of words that are very generous, and also to realize I could be discursive as opposed to just kind of trying to, no, I wasn't going with the words as much as I should have until the past few years. But I'm chattering away, but what I do is the opposite. If I find a sestina, for example, that I've written that's not quite working and I don't think is gonna work, I'll try and find the poem inside the sestina, and it'll become more free verse, if you will, but there's still the ghost of a sestina there. In fact, I was reading with someone once, and I turned to her during our Q&A, and I said, was this poem once a sestina? And she goes, yes. And I said, I could tell because of the incredible repetition of words that was not regular, but is just beautiful, it's captivating.
I shared exactly those thoughts. I mean, it's fun to have a poem you try to put in form, and it's fun when it fails and you turn it into a regular poem, and only you know, or you and a clever listener know that there's the ghost of a form hidden inside the poem. I think it's very kind of commonplace to do that, and those happy accidents that the process gives you.
To any of you that would like to answer, in the editorial process of each one of you with your text, when do you think it's time to stop?
Would you like to start?
I think that all of the time. And this is why you can find so many versions of my poems online, because I change my mind, right? So I think someone has said this better than I will now, but for my closure, sometimes I'm just letting it go. There's no more I can mine from it, or I really want the reader to do the mining. So my closure is all over the map. I will say that I look for a certain kind of power in my close. I like to, as I told my class earlier today, leave my readers with their distress. I'm not writing to soothe, I'm writing to evoke.
I would say, I hope when I've hit a nerve, my own nerve, I think, I just think it's intuitive after reading a lot and writing a lot. I think it's ultimately, for me, intuitive. The closure, I'm very serious about poetic closure. So but there has to be some kind of resonance. So that has become, over the years, intuitive. And like Vievee, I mean, if you were ever, anyone here, fortunate enough to hear Nell read, he'd revise in his book as he was reading. I mean, it was phenomenal. So I thought, oh, if Galway can do it.
And I think he said they're all just drafts until you die. He or someone did. Yeah. You know, for better or worse. Yeah. And because there's a couple Galway Canal poems where I have 3 or 4 different versions. things. Sometimes better, sometimes worse, and so it's tricky. How do you know? You don't really. Closure is great. I mean, closure is like one of the best tools we have in poetry land. You really can, like sometimes it's harder. Where does the poem start and where does it end, in a way? So, closure. There are at least kind of strategies for how might I get this to feel finished. However, you can sometimes get it to feel finished or sound finished when you kind of personally know, I don't think it really is finished. Right. You can just kind of sound those organ notes, but the poem really has some unresolved issues. So I think the best thing is to be able to leave, is to have the luxury of being a poet who's written a few books, so you can at that point let your poems really, really, really steep and ferment. And you can actually just say, 2 years, I just feel like there's still something missing from this poem. I'm going to keep it there and go back to it after 2 years and say, yeah, it did need this one more thing or whatever. That's much harder when you're writing a first book or when you're getting started. You can't let everything steep forever at the onset, but it's nice to have that luxury of let it tell you, no, it's really done after a couple years when you really don't see anything else to fix. I guess it's done.
I like that. Let the poem tell you.
This is your opportunity. It may not be so open in class. The balance depends upon the poet. Each poet on scale. So this is where I find my scale right now. But in 10 years from now, that scale will change again. So this is not the scale I had at 19, 20, 30, 35. This is the scale I have now. So each side is quite weighted. And what I weight it with is going to change. So I actually do think a bit about balance. And I read rather broadly, so I pay attention to the balance in other types of work. I tend to like work outside of my own type. And I like scale outside of scale. So I'm going to defer to Kimiko. I think it's a reading very broadly to find your own scale when you're writing.
In workshop today, as many of you know who are here, we talked about dialectics. Yesterday was Japanese Literature Day. Today was Marxist. So we're talking about dialectics and balance and contradiction. But going back to the Japanese aesthetics values asymmetry. Chinese aesthetics values symmetry. So there's also, and I don't know how that plays out in my own work, but I know that my poetics values thinking about those things.
Why McHale's Navy? Because I remember watching McHale's Navy on a black and white TV on the pull-out couch in my grandmother's apartment in 1965 or 66, or maybe a little bit later, eating a leftover pot roast sandwich. And and then when I published the poem, my aunt said, "We always knew Maggie's pot roast was going to make it in the Navy today." Well, I said, "Oh, okay." I mean, it's funny. To be honest, you could easily cut that part out of that poem. I have a earlier version of the poem where that little passage with McHale's Navy, because I'm a pop culture person and a cultural referencer, but that there's so much in that poem, you don't really need that per se. But in fact, the dean of Peter Miller of the Graduate Center at Bard was like, but isn't that your research? You know, aren't you a pop culture researcher too? So shouldn't you keep that McGill's Navy? And I said, like, okay, I think you're right. Oh, good. I appreciate it, Harold. I just started that book called The Search for the Mother Tree. It's called The Search for the Mother Tree, which has been around for a year or two. It's you know, I kept meaning to read, and I finally made myself buy it at a bookstore, which is, you know, ecology and this whole new understanding, although it doesn't seem like it should have taken that long to figure out how sentient trees are and how interconnected a system is. But it's really, really interesting, and I have been enjoying that. And in terms of poetry, the book I have really been blown away by this year is Roger Reeves's book. What is the name of that book? It's not Dear Barbarian, that's something else. That's what it's called. Whatever it's called, I can't remember. But that's how much it's moved me. You know, it's my favorite book of the year. I loved it. Saw him read in Miami. It's great. I liked his first book, which is called King Me. And this new book is just, it really blew me away. It's really, really good. That's one. So those are two of the many books floating around in my head right now.
I had a really rough school years, and I feel like I'm still collapsing from that. So I've been reading mostly detective novels, honestly. I was going to say a guilty pleasure, but it's not a guilty pleasure. It's just a pleasure. And I love, in terms of the classics, I love the language of hard-boiled noir. So there's some of that. I've also been reading Jean Korelitz's book, The Latecomer, and before that, The Plot. They're wonderfully, wonderfully written. Poetry, I am reading former students' manuscript that will be coming out in the fall. His name is Roger Smith, and his title is Machine Gun Radiation, and it's basically he writes about, he parallels having cancer and going through cancer as an African-American man in the medical system, and he parallels that with the police brutality and recent killings. And how did he do that? So it's an amazing feat. And then I'm reading my dear friend Nicole Cooley's manuscript, so we're sort of passing back and forth.
I'm reading a good deal of fiction right now, more than I usually do, particularly anything dealing with history in the last 2 years or since the reckoning, which is still moving, though quieter than before. And I found one of the nonfiction shelves of the bookstores my former students, many of whom worked with me in a small workshop, a small 2-week workshop. These types of workshops are so important. So I'm looking at their texts. I just finished Afro-Pessimism, and the author was a Dartmouth grad, which surprised me, and that was interesting. So I'm reading things that are making me incredibly uncomfortable, but I like that space because it's forcing me to rethink some things and to write things I might not have written earlier. And also, to balance that, I'm reading a good number of graphic novels. And some are riveting and poignant, and others are just pure Afrofuturist fun. So.
When you're drafting a poem, how do you push language? Do you, when you're writing these word banks, what are the strategies? Do you sit with the thesaurus open and like comb through it? How do you follow the music? Do you draft the concepts first and then go back and revise? I'm just so curious about each of your processes.
Did you guys ever have the book called Word List? It came out in like the 90s, I recall, and it was like, again, Google. So it was a guy who had like laboriously, a kind of dictionary maker, who made this kind of organizational, like structured lists of kinds of words.
I remember, yes.
And it'd be really helpful, because like if, let's say you were stumbling into like an architecture metaphor in a poem, you're saying like, what are other architecture words? Pedestal, lintel. And this guy had organized his book in these really exotic ways. It was great. It was a big, thick paperback. It was a labor of love. And now you can just find all that out by typing architecture terms into Google, which is sad for the dictionary makers, but it's very useful. So I think that I am very happy to go to my computer and say, okay, I'm at a linguistic loss, or I don't like this verb, or I'm just, there's more words I know in astronomy that are just right, but I don't know them. Let the computer tell me some things.
I would say same thing. So get a rough draft out there, and then I can, if a word needs to pop more, if there's an opportunity to have a word pop or play that word, because I want to make my words work really hard. I want to pressure cook them. So I'll do the same thing. And if I have a choice, I oftentimes, the ear, so the sound, the way it feels in the mouth, and also if there's double meanings, that makes me crazy, because then it becomes spatial, not just, it starts to levitate off the page.
I collect dictionaries, different types, even dictionaries that have nothing to do with the field I'm in. I'm interested in jargon, though I don't use a lot of it. I still want to store it up. So the way I put pressure on my language is to have as broad a vocabulary as possible. And I think lexical studies, etymology, I think about all of those things. I want to know the history of the word. Now, today we were talking about where the word tragedy comes from, this type of thing. So all of those things help push my language, but I've always loved language anyway. My brother speaks more than one language. My little sister is a speech pathologist and linguist. So I think all of my parents' children are interested in how language works. And honestly, I felt like if I couldn't master this tongue, then those who spoke this tongue were me. So I worked very hard for the skills I have, and yet people will correct me, which I enjoy, because then we can look it up together, and I don't know, you have to get your kicks some kind of way. So I do it through language, and yes, all of the above, the things you listed, all of the above. We both look the same way.
Right, long. But I was really interested in listening. Sorry. So the question long poems and strategies for long poems. We're repeating it for the simulcast or whatever you call it. I was interested in the strategy of, a 7-part format where you're using, with a language or fable to, kind of thing. Cause me actually, I mean, I've written poems, as book-length poems, but my book-length poem was narrative. It was really a story about it. It could have been a historical novel if I wrote prose, which I don't. So I wrote a historical novel poem. The lyric voice does have some kind of length limitations. Like, I think that Yankee Stadium poem is as far as I can possibly push just a sheer lyric kind of impulse poem. And even in that poem, there's the strategy of, okay, have 40 lines of verbs. They did, joy riding, Jim King, blah, blah, blah. Because it's a way of, I think when you're trying to extend a lyric poem beyond 2 pages, beyond a page and a half, you need a second act. You need another, it could be another language source, a kind of narrative or sub, or now it turns out to be about mythology and something, a term addition to the poem. And to get to 5 emotions and bring your quieter and kind of discursive moments between this through having not all the time, because I'm more naturally inclined one image that resonates, and I don't have. That's what I.
Idea, make a craft. Well, in the past, or up or some visual. I was talking with students, almost like looking at a music score and saying, "Oh, we need a rest there." So,
I write quite a number of short lyrics, so 14 lines and under, 12 lines and under, something like this. Some one poems. But I also write the long poem when I want to turn something over, when the vantage shifts. So if I'm writing an historical piece, then I want to take it from various sides or angles. And the other answer to that question would be, I write as long as I can emotionally take it. I'm an emotional writer, which does not mean there's no intellectual prowess, right? but I really do move through my emotions, and while I'm able to tolerate it, I'm writing, and so that goes back to closure. I often close when I reach my limit.
We reached our limit.
Thank you very much.